Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
Every Christmas in my family followed the same script that none of us admitted existed, where my parents turned the living room into a showroom for my sister's presents with price tags that could cover a mortgage payment, while my name sat on a flat little card with "Love you" written inside, and I'd pretend it didn't sting because I learned early that if I kept my face steady and my voice even, then the night would pass faster, and there would be fewer comments about me being sensitive or dramatic. But this year I decided to test what would happen if I stayed absolutely silent and let the balance shift without warning, because I had a promotion coming that I didn't announce, a raise they never asked me about, and a choice I had already made weeks before anyone strung the first set of lights. You know how families get stuck on a story they like about you, the kind that's convenient because it explains their habits, and even when you grow up and do something different they keep you trapped in the old role because changing it would mean admitting they ignored you. That's what it felt like every December when Amanda's pile grew higher with expensive vacations and jewelry and tickets to things she would eventually brag about online, while I opened a card that felt like a participation ribbon for being related, and I'd thank them and make a joke so no one noticed the little free fall in my stomach, and then I'd drive home telling myself it didn't matter because I had my own life, my own bills, my own plans. And yet the next morning I'd still wake up tight in the chest, wondering why I kept letting them do this. The ridiculous part is that my parents are not cartoon villains. They are two people who tell themselves a neat story about how the daughter who needed more attention got more, and the daughter who seemed fine got less. And as long as I stayed polite, they could keep the math tidy, and I helped them keep it tidy for years because I confused kindness with silence and grace with swallowing hard, until this fall when my boss called me into a small conference room and told me I'd earned the promotion that was supposed to go to someone louder, and I walked out steady on the outside, but shaking just enough to realize I didn't need to keep co-signing a family budget that always paid me in sentimental pennies. Once the promotion was real, once the raise was printed in the contract and the bonus hit my account, I made a decision that felt almost boring in how practical it was, because I didn't want a grand speech or a confrontation scene. I wanted proof that stood on its own legs, so I met with my bank, checked the numbers twice, scheduled a test drive, and kept my mouth shut, answering Amanda's chirpy messages about, "What do you want for Christmas this year?" with "I'm good, don't worry about me," which made her laugh react like I'd told a joke because she's used to me cushioning things, and I let her have that because the point wasn't getting them to understand me. The point was that I finally understood myself. There's something honest about buying something for yourself when no one else would ever think to give it to you, and I don't mean the price tag as a personality. I mean the decision to reward your work without apologizing for wanting nice things. And I'd love to tell you I picked the car because I've always dreamed of that exact model, but the truth is simpler and less cinematic. It was reliable, it was beautiful without being loud, it made financial sense with the new salary, and it represented a promise to myself that I would stop waiting for permission to feel proud, which is probably the closest thing to religion I have ever practiced. Still, I kept our family rhythms intact long enough to avoid suspicion, sent the usual, "What time should I bring dessert?" text to my mom, clicked a heart on my dad's photos of the house decorations, and even congratulated Amanda on her new espresso machine that my parents paid for with a smile, although I noticed they found a way to mention how responsible I am every time I bring something homemade. Like responsibility is a consolation prize you hand to the kid who never got a bike, and it was almost funny to watch myself from a distance, holding two truths at once, that I don't need their approval to live well, and that the child part of me still wanted them to look up and see me clearly. The night before I picked up the car, my dad called to ask whether I needed gas money for the drive to their house, because he remembers me scraping by in my early 20s, and he likes to feel generous, and I almost said no thank you the way I usually do. But something stopped me, and I paused long enough for him to fill the silence with his favorite line about how we always support our girls, and I swallowed a laugh, told him I was all set, and hung up with this cold, calm feeling that I wasn't angry anymore. I was done, and done is heavier than anger, but it's also quieter, and it lets you think straight. I signed the papers the next afternoon without ceremony, kept the photo simple, parked in my garage, and told exactly no one, because I wanted to see what happened when the announcement didn't travel through family first. When I didn't hand my good news over to the usual committee for comments and corrections, I wanted to drop the information into the world where my parents don't control the narrative and watch whether their version of me could survive one small fact. On the morning I chose, I posted a single picture with a 6-word caption that said everything I needed it to say without starting a fight, and I put my phone face down and made coffee I actually enjoyed, and for a few quiet minutes nothing happened. Which felt like standing in a doorway and waiting to see who notices you entered the room. Then my screen started lighting up, not with congratulations first, but with Amanda's comment that managed to sound friendly and mocking in the same breath. Followed by my mother's text asking whether this was a lease, and my father's message about appearances and timing and family, and as the notifications flooded in one after another, I realized the part that startled them wasn't the car or the money or even the independence. It was that I didn't ask. I read my dad's last message twice, the one where he said I was making us look a certain way, and the words landed differently than he meant, because I heard the truth underneath the scolding voice, the thing I wasn't supposed to understand. And I set the phone down without replying, because if there's one thing I learned from years of sitting there with a card and a forced smile, it's that you don't argue with a story someone needs to believe. You replace it with a fact they can't ignore. And I had just done that, which is when I noticed a separate text come in from a number I hadn't saved under a name, a number that should not have had anything to do with Christmas or cars or childhood roles, and when I opened it and saw the first sentence, I finally understood why my parents had been so uneasy all along. The unknown number turned out to be the sales manager from the dealership, a polite man who introduced himself and then, in a voice note that I played twice to make sure I wasn't inventing it, explained that a concerned family member had called right after I signed, identified himself as my father, and tried to undo the sale by saying I was impulsive, that I would regret the decision, that the family was planning a big purchase for my sister and did not want any confusion, and the manager said he refused because the paperwork was clean and paid and it was my name on every page, but he thought I should know in case the call came to me next, which left me on my couch with my phone in my hand and that steady clarity I only feel when something crosses a line I didn't draw but now have to enforce. I did not call my parents right away, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to walk into the conversation empty. So I pulled up the documents, added an extra authentication lock to the title and the insurance, set a fraud alert with the credit bureaus because apparently that is a thing adults quietly do after their parents treat them like a teenager with a debit card, and then I sat with the ugly truth that my dad didn't just feel embarrassed. He felt entitled to manage my life in the same way he has always managed Christmas, and once I saw it that plainly I could not unsee it, which meant the rules had to change now, not in some future when everyone had cooled off. The group chat had already shifted from sarcasm to moral lecture, with Amanda performing the role of gentle peacekeeper while throwing in those little digs that let her keep the high ground, and my mother sending paragraphs about timing and respect and thinking of the family's image, and I stared at the chat the way you look at a contract you never signed, because for years I had agreed without noticing, and this year my silence was going to be the loudest sentence in the conversation, so I typed exactly one message that said I would not be attending the gift exchange and I wished everyone a nice evening, and then I muted the thread, not out of spite, but because I needed room in my head that didn't echo with their outrage. If you want to know what the first act of revenge looked like, it wasn't the car or the post or even the muting, it was the practical decision to stop subsidizing a story that erased me. So I logged into the family phone plan that I have paid for since my mid-20s because it was easier for me to handle the autopay, and I removed my card, transferred my number out, and sent a short note to my mother saying I had simplified my accounts and they would need to update their payment method by the end of the month, and I cannot describe the quiet satisfaction of clicking a button that returns your life to you without raising your voice, because it is not about punishing them financially. It is about refusing to carry the everyday weight that lets them pretend the hierarchy is natural. Amanda called within minutes, using that sweet tone that adults use with toddlers and pets, asking whether I was okay and whether the car was a cry for attention. And I said I was fine and the car was a purchase for me in the same way her trips and designer gifts are purchases for her, and then she shifted to the real point, which was that our parents had been planning a big reveal for her at dinner, and I had stolen the moment, and I said I hadn't known because no one tells me anything until. I'm sitting on the couch with my card and my smile, and there was a long silence where I could feel her choosing between honesty and performance, and she chose performance, telling me I was being selfish after everything our parents have done. Which is the script line that always pops up right before the guilt lands, and this time I let it float by untouched. I told her, calmly, that Dad had called the dealership to cancel my purchase, and the silence that followed wasn't theatrical, it was real, because she hadn't expected me to have receipts, and then she said something that gave the whole game away. That he probably just wanted to make sure I didn't embarrass myself, and I said I am not an embarrassment and I am no longer available for that role, and that was the end of that call, because there is nothing to argue once the part has been recast. My mother tried next, switching to worried instead of angry, asking whether I was coming to dinner because my aunt and uncle wanted to see me, and I said I wasn't, and she asked what she should tell them, and I said she could tell them the truth. That I have plans that do not include sitting in a room where my life gets measured in how little space I take up, and she threw out the olive branch that never costs her anything, and offered to write my name on a separate little envelope so I would not feel left out. And I said that from now on we would match, which she didn't get until I told her that this year I would be sending them a card that said "Love you" inside and nothing else, and she made a shocked sound like I had just kicked a puppy. Which tells you everything about who has been expected to carry the grace here. Once the logistics were handled, I took a breath and looked at the calendar and realized the dealership's pickup appointment sat right on the afternoon of the family dinner, not by design at first. But the more I stared at it, the more it looked like a clean line through my old life, so I confirmed the time, scheduled a detailing, and booked myself a quiet dinner reservation for one. Because the second act of revenge is not flashing wealth at people who refuse to clap, it is leaving the stage. And building your own room where their applause isn't required, and I felt a small surge of something that wasn't pride exactly, but was definitely mine. That night, after I brushed my teeth and set my alarm, my phone lit up again with a message from the same dealership manager, only this time he wasn't warning me. He was forwarding a voicemail my father had just left for him. A voicemail that started with apologies and moved quickly into strategy, and by the time I reached the part where he said the words "family title workaround," I had already opened my laptop and started a list of every account, document, and spare key I still needed to lock down before morning. The voicemail the manager forwarded was short and dressed up as concern, the kind of tone my father uses when he wants a stranger to feel like he is the reasonable adult in the room. Yet under the polite phrases and the little pauses there was a clear request to hold the title at the desk for a family pickup, along with a suggestion that if the paperwork needed a small adjustment he could bring a family authorization. So everything would stay tidy, and the manager, to his credit, ended by saying he would never release anything to anyone but the purchaser, which should have been the end of it, but the phrase he used, "family title workaround," kept echoing in my head because it was exactly the kind of quiet maneuver that explains so much about how the holidays always turned out the way they did without anyone ever saying a hard word out loud. I put the phone on speaker, opened my laptop, and started doing the unglamorous work that people who have had their boundaries crossed learn to do early, which is make every system proof against the next small invasion. So I added dual authentication to the insurance account, put a password on the vehicle profile, called the state office to confirm that duplicate title requests would require an in-person appearance with identification, and that no third-party notes could be added without my signature, and then I sent the dealership an email that summarized the voicemail in simple language, included a request to document in my file that no calls about my vehicle should be entertained or noted without my written consent, and thanked the manager for being careful with my information, because it matters to get polite on the record when you know the next step might not be polite at all. The group chat, which I had muted, was still doing laps around the same track, Amanda playing social referee while getting in little digs about me needing therapy for holiday triggers. My mother sending long messages about how families present themselves to the world, and my father dropping those short lines that sound like wisdom if you don't know the context. And I stared at the stacked bubbles and thought about the way I have been trained to answer in paragraphs, while the people who cut me down do it in glancing sentences that leave no handhold, and I decided that if this was going to change, then the way I communicate had to change with it. I was not going to give them a monologue that they could take apart one polite sentence at a time. I was going to give them a single piece of information that required no debate at all. Before I sent anything, I checked every place where my name had been offered as a convenience to the family in the past, and I cleaned house, which in practice meant I took my card off the shared cloud storage I had paid for since my early 20s because you're so good with subscriptions. I transferred my streaming accounts back to a personal plan, and I submitted the form to release myself from being the emergency contact for Amanda's daycare pickups, because I love my niece, but I will not keep structuring my life around emergencies that only pop up when there is a sale at the mall, and I wrote a short, factual email to the landlord who manages the duplex my parents co-signed for my sister years ago to confirm there were no open authorizations under my name and to place in their file that I am not and never have been a guarantor. Which might sound petty until you have seen your credit score dip because a relative forgot to set a reminder. The next call came from Amanda's partner, who has always been polite in a way that reads as neutral until you realize he only calls me when it helps Amanda pretend she is above the argument, and he tried the calm voice. Asked whether I could at least show up for dessert so no one would talk, and I said that I have no interest in being background furniture for a night built around a reveal I was not told about, and he shifted to practicalities. Asked whether the car was a financial stretch, and whether he should help me resell it so the family would stop worrying. Which is the moment the humor finally showed up for me, because there is a special kind of confidence it takes to offer a woman you barely respect financial advice about a purchase you tried to cancel behind her back. And I ended the call by saying I would not be discussing my money with anyone who thinks it is theirs to manage. Here is the part that felt like revenge even though it was just the truth. I forwarded my father's voicemail to the family chat without a caption, because there are times when the only clean move is to hold up the mirror and stop talking. And then I watched the typing dots blink and vanish and blink again as if the room had finally lost the script, and for the first time in a long time, no one had a quick reply, not even Amanda, who is never without a line, and the silence stretched long enough for me to feel my jaw unclench, which is not victory on a scoreboard, but it is absolutely a win when the game has always been erasing what happened 5 minutes after it happened. The silence did not last. It never does, because someone always decides that control can be regained if they sound reasonable enough, and my mother stepped forward to say the audio must be a misunderstanding and that my father was simply checking on a detail. And I replied with a single sentence confirming that no one is to contact any vendor or office about anything under my name, that I would consider further attempts a breach of privacy, and that I would be handling all future communication through email only, which outraged her because email is cold and family is supposed to be warm, and there it was, the tell in plain sight, because warmth is the word people use when they want to keep doing what they do without anyone writing it down. After that, I did one more thing for myself that I should have done years ago. I filed a brief identity protection report with the credit bureaus, not because I think my father is a criminal, but because it is easier to stop a mess from starting than to clean it up after it spills, and then I made a copy of the voicemail, saved it to a drive that is not shared with anyone, and took a screenshot of the group chat so I would never again second-guess whether I imagined any part of this, and the tiny relief of having the facts lined up in a row did more for my spine than any pep talk ever could. By late afternoon, the group chat had shifted into "we love you but" mode, which is the last step before the guilt parade, and I could feel the gravitational pull of it, the old reflex to smooth the edges so no one has to feel discomfort. And I did what I promised myself I would do if I ever felt that tug again. I chose a different action, which was to log off, get my keys, and drive to the dealership half an hour early, because if there was one place I wanted to be when they started up again, it was standing next to the decision they could not unmake for me. And when I walked through the glass doors, the manager greeted me by name, handed me a folder with the finalized paperwork, and slid a small envelope across the table with a business card on top. which would have been routine except for the name written underlined in black ink on the envelope, a name I had not seen on paper since I was a teenager, and in that second I understood that the real story behind this holiday had been running under my feet for years without me seeing it. The underlined name on the envelope was my Aunt Diane, the sister my mother stopped speaking to when I was still a teenager after a fight that was supposedly about tone and respect, but always felt bigger and older than anything I could have caused. And seeing her name in thick black ink at the dealership desk made the back of my neck go cold because it meant someone outside the little triangle of my parents and my sister had been watching events line up and decided I might need help that would not be erased by a family story or a quick apology. And when the manager explained that a woman had called that morning, said she was a relative who had seen my post, and asked him to hand me this envelope just in case the family tried something with the title, I felt the odd relief that shows up only when you realize you are not crazy and you are never alone. You were just taught to handle things quietly so the people who benefited could keep calling it harmony. I opened the envelope at his desk because I wanted to see it before I drove anywhere, and inside there was a business card with my aunt's cell number and a short handwritten note that didn't waste a single word, telling me she had found documents while cleaning out storage that I should have had years ago, that she was sorry she had waited this long, and that if I wanted to know what really happened to the account my grandparents set up for me when I was a kid, I should call her today before I signed anything else with my father's name anywhere near it, and reading that sentence landed like a key turning, because suddenly the family title workaround voicemail from my dad wasn't an overreaction or a one-off power grab. It was part of a pattern I had been trained not to see. I called my aunt from the dealership parking lot, and she picked up on the second ring, said my name like she had practiced it, and then told me the kind of story that makes your ribs tighten because it lays out, calmly and without drama, how something you were told didn't exist actually did, and how the adults who were supposed to protect it made choices that suited them instead. And the version was simple. My grandparents had set up 2 small custodial accounts when we were kids. One for me and one for Amanda. Not life-changing money, but real help meant to be released when we reached the age of majority. And while Amanda's account had been spent on tutoring and a graduation trip and then cleared without any confusion, the account in my name had been temporarily borrowed during the year my parents were helping Amanda with her wedding down payment, which was supposed to be repaid but never was, and when my aunt raised it at the time she was told to mind her business and that I had agreed, which I obviously had not because no one told me there was anything to agree to, and my aunt had kept the file after that fight because she thought someday I might need it, and then life got messy, and time kept moving, and she was ashamed she let that someday stretch this long. She asked where I was and I told her, and she asked if I could meet for 10 minutes since she lived 15 minutes from the dealership and had the folder in her car. And I said yes because I didn't want to carry this mystery home where it would get buried under 1,000 messages about family image. And 15 minutes later I was sitting across from the woman who had slipped me $20 bills at school events and told me I was allowed to be more than the quiet one, and she handed me a thin folder with copies of account statements, a cover letter from the bank dated the year of Amanda's wedding that used the phrase temporary custodial transfer in a way that would make any normal person stop and ask questions, and a timeline my aunt had typed up that included the exact month my parents started treating me like I was irresponsible for asking basic things about tuition help. And the neatness of those dates side by side made me feel both sick and steady because nothing builds a spine like facts on paper. I am not naive. I understand families borrow and shift money all the time when people are struggling and that there is grace in being generous. But generosity requires the person who owns the thing to be told and to agree. And the truth that cracked open for me in that parking lot was that my parents never once considered me the owner of anything, not the savings my grandparents intended for me, not my decisions, not even the title to my car. Because being the kid who needed less made me the perfect source of temporary solutions, and seeing it that clearly turned the ache of being overlooked into something cleaner and sharper that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with boundaries that should have existed before I could even spell the word boundary. I did the next right thing for myself, which was to take photos of every page with timestamps, send a thank you text to my aunt promising we would talk again after I sat with this, and then I walked back into the dealership and asked the manager to note in my file, in writing, that no one other than me was authorized to make or request changes under any circumstances, after which I finished the pickup, signed exactly where my name belonged, and slipped the keys into my pocket with a small decision that from now on my emergency contact was going to be the person who actually protected me when it mattered, which is how my aunt's number replaced my father's in the blank labeled "call in case of incident." And the quiet relief of seeing that change printed on a form was almost absurd in how much it helped. When I got home, I did not explode in the group chat or write a manifesto because screaming into a room that is built for denial only feeds the denial, so I sent one message with no commentary at all. A forward of the voicemail my father had left at the dealership and a scanned image of the bank letterhead from the year of Amanda's wedding that included my name in the subject line and the words, "Temporary Custodial Transfer." And then I turned the phone face down and opened my laptop because the third act of revenge is often boring on the surface. It is spreadsheets and settings and unsubscribes and logins and strong passwords. It is documenting everything so when the story starts spinning you can put your finger on the page and say here is what happened and here is when and here is who, which is how I spent the next hour building a clean little folder with dates and files that told the truth without me narrating it. The replies came in flurries the way they always do when control slips. My mother accusing my aunt of stirring up old drama and insisting the bank letter was a misunderstanding that was handled responsibly. Which made me laugh out loud because if it had been handled responsibly then I would have known about it before today. And Amanda trying the soft landing approach by suggesting we were all tired and should not ruin Christmas over paperwork. Which is a perfect sentence when you want a person to abandon facts for peace, and my father skipping ahead to the part where he speaks like a manager addressing staff and writing that he had only ever acted in the family's best interest and had never once attempted to harm me. Which is the line that sounds good in his head and looks very different next to a voicemail asking a dealership to hold a title for a family pickup. It would have been easy in that moment to hit send on the draft I had typed that detailed every petty slight and every holiday humiliation because the adrenaline was high and the silence inside me had uncoiled into a clean, steady anger. But I did not do it because I have learned that the most effective move is the one that cannot be reinterpreted or spun or minimized, and the truth is that my father's words and the bank's letter already said enough without me adding anything, so instead I made a different choice, one that would land without noise and would stick where it needed to stick, and I wrote a separate email to the small circle of relatives who actually noticed me, attaching the two files with a one-sentence note that said I would not be at dinner, that I wished them well, and that any future conversations about my life would happen in writing, which is the kind of sentence that sounds harsh if you have never been erased and sounds like oxygen if you have. Then, because I promised myself each step would not only defend but also build, I booked something I should have booked the day I signed the promotion, a simple week away that did not ask anyone for permission and did not bend around anyone's reveal. And I set the departure for the very hour I was supposed to be sitting on my parents' couch with a card on my lap, so that when the texts started flying on the holiday morning about traffic and timing and who was bringing pie, I would be in a seat, with my phone on airplane mode and my shoulders down, and before I shut my laptop I did one last petty, but deeply satisfying thing, which was to schedule a single post for the evening of the family dinner with a short caption that would look breezy to anyone outside and would read like a bell to the people inside, and the caption said, as calmly as a door closing, that some traditions are just habits with good PR, and that breaking one isn't rebellion, it's maintenance, and I attached exactly one image, not of the car or the trip or anything flashy, but of a small metal key tag I had engraved that afternoon with my grandmother's first name, a name my mother still can't say without softening. And as I hovered over the schedule button, my phone lit up with a new message from Amanda, not a paragraph or a lecture this time, just a single photo of a small velvet box with a key-shaped charm peeking out and a line that said, "Can we talk before tonight?" And right after it, before I could finish rolling my eyes, came a calendar invite from my father titled Family Title Discussion, and that was the moment I realized the next move would not be mine alone because someone else in the family had finally decided to stop pretending as well. When the calendar invite landed with that sterile title about a family title discussion, and Amanda's photo of the velvet box arrived right after, I sat there for a full minute without moving because I wanted to hear the difference between the old reflex that tells me to smooth things over and the new voice that says make it plain, then make it final. And once I heard the second voice clearly enough, I called Amanda first, not to hash it out or to trade jabs, but to give her one chance to stop performing for the audience and speak to me like a sister who knows where all the old cracks are. And she answered right away like she had been waiting with the call screen open, and she launched into this careful speech about the charm being a symbol, about family keys and keeping doors open, and I let her talk until there was nothing left in the sentence but air, after which I told her I was not interested in charms or symbols or gestures that photograph well. I was interested in one thing only, which is accountability in writing with signatures under it, and because I did not raise my voice and did not sound angry, she had to ask me what I meant, which is when I said that I had the bank letter and the voicemail and the timeline, and that I would be sending our parents a formal note that did not ask for apologies or explanations, only repayment of what was temporarily borrowed from my custodial account, returned to an account that would not be held by me but would be held in our grandmother's name as a small fund for education and first vehicles for the next generation of girls in this family, starting with her daughter and, if I ever choose to have one, mine. Because the money was always meant to help a girl stand on her own 2 feet, and I refused to let the story end with 2 parents pretending that borrowing without consent is love. She did not like that answer. Not because it was mean, it wasn't, but because it left her no stage to stand on, and she tried to wedge a little guilt in by asking whether I was trying to humiliate them online, and I said I was not posting a single document. Not one, that I was not interested in public court, and that my audience was very small and very boring. It was the bank, a notary, and any relative directly affected by the original accounts, and that the only thing going on social media tonight was the scheduled post with a key tag engraved with our grandmother's name, because symbols without paper mean nothing and paper without symbols is easy to bury. And I wanted both for once, and her side told me she understood the trap was gone. Not because I was trapping her, but because I had stepped outside the game entirely. Then I accepted my father's calendar invite, but I changed the format to a video call that required recording, and I set it to start in 20 minutes, with a short agenda that had 3 bullet points written in plain language. And while I waited, I drafted the letter in simple sentences that used the bank's own words, a letter that explained that I knew about the temporary custodial transfer, that I was not asking for explanations, that I expected the amount listed on the statements plus a fair adjustment for the years it sat unpaid to be deposited into a new account in our grandmother's name by the end of the first week of the new year, that the account would be managed by a third-party custodian with me and my aunt as co-advisors, and that failure to meet that deadline would force me to pursue recovery by whatever civil means are available, which is not a threat when you say it calmly. It is a boundary with a door in it, and I CC'd my aunt because she is the one adult in the room who has demonstrated she will not let things disappear under rugs and casseroles. The call began with my mother smiling the way she smiles at waiters she needs a favor from, and my father with his manager voice already warmed up, and I kept my camera on and my notes open. And I did not rehearse a speech or try to make them understand my feelings because they already know, they have always known, and pretending they do not is part of the way this works, so I opened with a line they did not expect, which was to thank them for calling the dealership because it forced a conversation that should have happened years ago, and then I shared my screen, displayed the bank letter, played the voicemail, and stated the terms of the fund without raising my tone, and the silence that followed was not the dramatic kind. It was the kind that happens when 2 people realize all the exits they usually use are closed. My father tried the first exit anyway, the one labeled misunderstanding, and then the one labeled we always meant to put it back, and finally the one labeled family should not do things like this in writing. And I nodded because he needed to feel heard and because it gave me the chance to say the one sentence that changed everything, which was that I was not doing this to get my slice back. I was doing this so the next girl does not grow up being told to be grateful for a card while her future is used as petty cash, and the look on my mother's face told me that sentence landed in the only place left in her that can still be moved, which is somewhere just under the part that knows what our grandmother would have said if she were sitting at this table. Amanda joined late, saw the shared screen, and stayed quiet in a way that made me think she now understood that calling vendors and writing narratives was over, and my father said he would need time to consult accounts. And I told him the deadline in the letter was firm and reasonable, and that there would be no further discussion tonight because I was leaving town and would be unreachable until after the holiday. And my mother asked where I was going and whether we could at least exchange cards tomorrow morning, and I said I already sent theirs and that it would arrive by courier before dinner, and she made a noise that I have never heard from her, a kind of mix of disbelief and something that might be respect. And then I ended the call because there was nothing left to say that words could improve. I packed a small bag, slid the key tag into my pocket, and on the way to the airport I stopped at a mailbox and dropped in 3 envelopes that cost almost nothing and meant absolutely everything. One to the bank with the signed documents to open the new fund. One to my aunt with a thank you that made me feel like a kid who finally picked the right adult to trust, and one to my parents that contained a single card with the words "Love You" written in my handwriting above a printout of the funds setup instructions and the deadline date, and I smiled without bitterness because for once the card was not an empty gesture, it was a marker placed on the exact spot where things changed. The post I scheduled went up that evening while I was buckled into a seat and halfway to a place where no one knows our family or our habits, and by the time I turned my phone back on there were the usual comments you get when you quietly change your life. But there was also a single message from my mother that simply said your grandmother would have approved, and a short note from Amanda that read, "I will transfer my part tonight," which told me the center of gravity had finally shifted, not with fireworks or apologies, but with money moving the way it should have moved years ago, and with grown people doing grown work without audience applause. I do not pretend this fixed everything, because that would be another neat story to tuck us in at night, and I do not pretend there will not be backlash or side comments or 1,000 little tests in the months to come. But the core is settled in a way that it has never been, which is that I did not ask for permission, I did not make a scene, I did not sell my pain for likes. I wrote terms and I enforced them, and I turned what could have been a messy public fight into a quiet correction that will outlive this year's ornaments, and when the funds clear and the first small grant goes to my niece for whatever she decides will move her forward, a class or a course or a starter car when she is old enough, I will know that the last gift my grandparents tried to hand me finally landed where it belonged. The next morning I drank bad airport coffee and laughed at the little reflex that still wanted to check the group chat for weather updates and head counts, and I let it pass. And for the first time I felt the Christmas story I wanted as a kid show up in my adult life. Not the one with piles and with favoritism dressed up as love, but the one where I treat myself like a person whose work counts and whose boundaries hold. And the one where the card I write is not a placeholder for what I was denied, but the final move in a plan that does not need anyone's validation to be true. And if you are wondering whether it was too far, whether I should have just let it go for the sake of peace, I can only say that peace without fairness is a performance I am done auditioning for, and that when my plane touched down and my phone pinged with a bank notification about a new account in my grandmother's name showing an initial deposit that matched the first line in my aunt's folder, I knew I had not burned a bridge, I had built one with guardrails, and I was the one who finally laid down the rules for crossing.